I turn now, in my second lecture, to the first defined historical period of comics, the Golden Age, when the comic book proper developed. The comic book developed through a profusion of separate issues, and I want to use this to introduce my second Cuskin rule: synthesize the details. In this, I offer a global observation. The factual record contains, like the comic book page itself, a tremendous amount of detail. Sorting through those detail is interpretive work. That is, choosing which details will contribute to your argument is the work of interpretation. It is the work of taking details and making them into something new. That work is essentially analytic, breaking down the historical record or the comic book page and finding the details you want to use. And it is also synthetic, pulling those details into a new statement. So in this lecture, I will present many of the facts of the Golden Age, of comic book history, but my goal is to synthesize them for you into a new whole. To begin, the comic pamphlet begins, arguably, in 1919 with Bringing Up Father, a collection of reprinted books presented in a 9-inch square with a cardboard cover. It sold for 25 cents at newsstands and in passenger trains. This was followed some years later by Polly and Her Pals, an issue of Comic Monthly, which also reprinted materials from the Hearst Syndicate newspapers. And it was 24 pages, a little smaller than Bringing Up Father, and it was published monthly. This, too, presented reprinted materials in a small square. In 1929, The Funnies came out. This was done by George Delacourt, who collected rejects from major newspapers. It lost money at 10 cents, so he rose the price to 30. That didn't work, so he dropped it down to 5. Harry Wildenberg used copies as a Gulf oil giveaway at gas stations. Wildenberg went on, a couple years later, to create Funnies on Parade, a very rare comic now, for Eastern Color Printing. Working with Max Gaines for George Janicek, they created an 8-page, small, larger than Bringing Up Father or Comic Monthly, small issue, which was a giveaway for Procter & Gamble. Wildenberg and Gaines went on then, later that year, to create Famous Funnies, a carnival of comics, which is a much thicker endeavor, also of reprinted materials and given away at Woolworth's department stores. Famously, Wildenberg and Gaines slapped a 10-cent sticker on later editions and sold it. Later that year, in 1934, they went on to create Famous Funnies, #1, also reprinted material, kind of a copy of Famous Funnies, Carnival of Comics, but much thicker. And this was a 400,000 copy sellout. It inspired them to go on and create Famous Funnies #1 Series 2 for American News. This became an ongoing serial that ran until 1955. All these pamphlets of various sizes and shapes, various thickness and depth, all these pamphlets reprinted pre-existing newspaper material. All these different titles are working towards figuring out how to package strips, newspaper strips, in a book format. This brings me to my thesis for my second lecture. That thesis is, the comic book is a metonym. Now, permit me to expand this thesis somewhat. Metonymy is a trope. You'll remember, a trope is a turn. It means turn in Greek, and it's a turn on language, a use of language different from the ordinary. Metonymy uses language in two ways. First, metonymy uses language as a change of name. In this case, it changes old material for new material. It changes newspaper strips for comics. Metonymy is a change of name, and that's what we see going on with these pamphlets. Metonymy is also a principle of association. It works by associating things. So one aspect of metonymy, a subcategory, is synecdoche, which means part for whole. So a part for whole would be individual strips for a book, individual stories for a freestanding book of stories. Comic books come together in this notion of metonymy because when they are first created, they are created from all these separate entities and pulled together into a freestanding material object. My goal in saying this, what I find so interesting, is that the comic book is an example of a literary trope, a figure of speech that takes on material form to become a powerful freestanding entity. In effect, it makes a poetic principle real. Let me explore this a little bit by talking about how comics history proceeds. The star of my story in this point is that great first Action Comics, the first appearance of Superman, the first superhero and arguably the greatest superhero. And the story continues here with a very colorful character known as Major Malcolm Wheeler Nicholson. Born in 1890 in Tennessee and then later moved to Portland, Wheeler Nicholson claimed to be the youngest major in the Army. And he had a number of kind of daring exploits and a storied past. He ended up in New York as a publisher, first a writer, and then creating the company National Allied Publications. He turned to comic books, but he found that the field was already stripped bare, that the reprints rights had been soaked up by those earlier comics. And so he endeavored a new plan. He produced New Fun, the big comic magazine, sold for 10 cents. New Fun's angle was that it presented new material, not reprints. And you can see at the bottom of the issue there, new comic strips, aircraft, radio, movies, stories, adventure, mystery, sports, prizes. New Fun was the first comic book of original material. Now, well, Wheeler Nicholson went on, but in order to make his new company run, he began to work with a publisher of pulp fiction. That was prose stories, a publisher of prose stories known as Harry Donenfeld. Now, Wheeler went on to produce detective comics, but in order to get this out of his shop, he partnered with Donenfeld. Donenfeld sent Wheeler Nicholson and his wife on a cruise, and while Wheeler Nicholson was away, Donenfeld took action. He foreclosed on Wheeler Nicholson, filing a suit for debt. When Wheeler Nicholson and his wife returned, their locks were changed on the office, and Donenfeld and his accountant had taken over the whole business. Together, they went forward with the comic books under the National Allied Publications. They then changed it to Detective Comics, and Detective Comics became what is now DC Comics. So Wheeler was approached by Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster with the notion of Superman, and Wheeler didn't like it, and Donenfeld found it distasteful. But eventually, Donenfeld felt that he could go forward with it, and the first Action Comics came out featuring Superman. And I want to stop and take a look at that cover, because there's something bold here, and Donenfeld initially apparently didn't like it at all. He felt that it was grotesque and tasteless, but the statement there is powerful. The statement there is not just Superman's strength, but a sense of overturning everything. The gentleman in the foreground, he's running away. His eyes are boggling at what Superman represents. Superman represents Action Comics as busting out of existing categories. And very much, Siegel and Shuster, who created Superman, they were breaking out of the existing genres. But Action Comics wasn't entirely Superman comics. In fact, when you opened up that comic book, the first thing you saw was Superman's origin. And that in itself was fantastic. And Siegel and Schuster attempt to explain it there, explain Superman's escape from a dying planet, and explain his superpowers. But that's not all that was contained in that comic book. Indeed, the comic book presented every kind of genre imaginable. Remember, genre is another literary term. It means family. So this comic book, Action Comics 1, presents many different families of storytelling within it. Superman certainly was the cover piece, but after that we got Chuck Dawson, a cowboy tale told in black and white. And after Chuck, Zatara, the master magician, who was involved in all sorts of intrigue. After that, a prose story, South Sea Strategy, by Captain Frank Thomas. From there, some comedic nonsense, Sticky Mitt Stimson, who steals an apple. Onwards, The Adventures of Marco Polo, a kind of historical fiction. And further from that, Pet Morgan, a boxing tale. It went further. Scoop Scanlon, five-star reporter who's involved in all sorts of crime and intrigue. From there, Tex Thompson, a strange tale taking place, I believe, in England. And further, it closes with some pin-ups of contemporary stars. Fred Astaire. Action Comics is not just breaking apart genre by introducing a new genre, the superhero, who is capable of picking up a car and smashing it against rocks, but it's also containing any number of genres itself. So it is innovative and it is collective. Now, that innovation by Siegel and Schuster was so powerful that it redefined what comics could be. Indeed, Superman took off right away. Donfeld's reservations about having Superman on the cover were quickly put aside. And yet, Siegel and Schuster, creators of the Golden Age superhero, they were simply hired as work for hire. They were given a check that when they signed off, that was their payments. No royalties. Now, Superman became such a hit that they were able to keep working for hire and make good livings. But nevertheless, all that money went back to Donenfeld. Superman's innovation is so powerful that the world over now recognizes Superman. And that first Action Comics, one copy, 2 years ago, sold for $2.16 million. That's how powerful that innovation in genre was. So to pull together all these details, I offer you the comic book as metonym. And I mean that on a number of different levels. On a material level, the comic book formulates separate stories as a single object. It takes parts and makes them whole. It changes the name of those parts from Scoop Scanlon, Superman, Tex Thompson, to Action Comics overall. That brings us to the intellectual level. The comic book is a whole in the face of fragments. So therefore, we think not that Action Comics is a collection of stories, but that Action Comics is a whole. It has a unity. That unity brings us to the imaginative level. That unity is our own mind's ability to hold together a library of stories, to hold together many genres as a library for our own imagination. So the beauty of the comic book is that it is simultaneously poetic and imaginative and material and real. Those two simultaneous qualities work together in every single comic book.